So now in this part, we're going to upload a jar file from a Maven project and Gradle projects to our Nexus repository. And since we already have Maven releases and Maven snapshots repositories from Nexus created by default, we don't have to create a Maven repository. We're going to use the existing Maven hosted repository, and we're going to upload our jar file to that hosted repository or Nexus. And for both Maven and Gradle, there is a special command that lets you push to a remote repository. However, before you execute that command, we need to configure both tools to connect to Nexus, because obviously you need some type of authentication. So we need to give a Gradle tool or a Maven tool credentials to Nexus so that it can authenticate, as well as the address, right? So the tool needs to know where is this repository, what is the URL, where can I talk to it, and then obviously provide username and password to authenticate. Realistic use cases, we won't give developers the admin user and password for our Nexus Repository Manager. We're going to create Nexus users with permission to upload artifact file in certain repositories, and then we're going to use that Nexus user to upload the jar files from our laptop. So the first thing is we're going to create Nexus user and give it permission to upload artifacts. So let's go to security and users. Here you see we have admin and anonymous as defaults. We're going to create a new user. I'm just going to give it my name. Just fill in all the required fields. As I said, usually you wouldn't create manually those users. You would integrate the existing users from your company system using LDAP integration and then give it Nexus permissions. But in this case, we can create a user manually. Let's set it to active. We can actually give it anonymous role for now, but we're going to create its own role for this Nexus user. So let's go to roles, create role. And it's a Nexus role type. Let's call it Nexus Java. You can call it whatever. And this is the list of permissions that we can give our role. And this is very granular because the best practice when generally creating permissions for users is to give the least necessary permission to a user to execute a task that it really needs to execute, because obviously we don't want users, system users, for example, to have a lot of permissions. We want to limit them. So here, if we go through the list, you see for every action that you can perform in Nexus, there is its own privilege. And if I search for Maven snapshots, for example, I see the list with prefixes, with two categories with prefixes. Here we have repository admin, all with a star, and browse, delete, edit, read, and you also have repository view. So usually, and this is the same for every repository type, every task in Nexus, and general rule is that the admin permission is usually for the administrators of Nexus. Again, this could be our operations team or DevOps team. This could also be developers if they're managing their own Nexus Repository Manager. In big companies, usually there is a dedicated team, and these are administrators of Nexus who take care of the backups, installing plugins, and so on. And they're users, mostly developers, who actually need to upload artifacts from their projects to Nexus or download, fetch artifacts from Nexus, and so on. So these are two categories. And since this is going to be a role to upload jar and then to retrieve information about jar, we're going to go with the view. So permission or privilege for Nexus user. And we can actually choose the star. So basically being able to add, browse, delete, edit, etc. So let's move it here and scroll to the bottom to click save to create the role. And now we can actually assign this role to our user. Let's actually move it back. We don't need it. So we have this new role assigned here. And now we can use this user this Nexus user in our project to give Gradle or Maven credentials of this user to connect to our Nexus. So the first thing we are going to do now is add a plugin for publishing a jar to Maven formatted repository. Because note that both Gradle and Maven projects use the same Maven to format to upload the Java artifacts. And this will allow Gradle or enrich Gradle with ability to connect to Nexus and push to its Maven repository. So to add the plugin to the project in your editor, you can just refresh the Gradle project. As always, you can find all this code and configuration in the linked Git repositories under the lecture. So you can follow the demo and code along just as I do. And then finally, you can use those Git repositories to reference the final code and check against that. So now that we have the plugin, as a next step, we're going to configure publishing block. And here we are going to configure publications and repositories blocks. So publications is basically the jar file configuration that we're going to upload, and repository is the Nexus repository that we're going to upload that jar file to. So now let's configure those two blocks. In publications part, we have Maven publications, another block, and here we're going to define our artifact. So I'm going to copy the configuration in. Artifact, this is the location of the artifact. So when we build the project, Gradle will actually create a build folder /libs, and it will generate and put the jar in that folder. So this is going to be the path to our jar file. And obviously we need some versioning. And this version here comes from this line. So we define the version here. So the version can be adjusted here. And whatever version is set here will be substituted as the version of that jar file. And extension is jar in this case. So again, artifact location and the format or extension of that artifact. So this is what we need to configure in the publications part. It may seem a little bit too much, but you don't have to learn it by heart. You can basically just copy it from somewhere just to understand the concept. That we define the artifact configuration here because Gradle needs to know where to find that artifact to upload. And now here we're going to configure where to upload that artifact to. So basically the address of Nexus and the credentials. So let's go and do it. And this is, I think, a little bit more intuitive. I'm going to copy that in. So here again, we have Maven block, like in this one. Name of the repository manager, we're pushing to Nexus. So Nexus, this is the URL of the repository in your repository manager. So here we are going to need the IP address and port of Nexus itself. Let's go back to Nexus and copy that. Like this. The IP address of Nexus, the port where Nexus is running. Then we have repository / name of the repository, right? So in this case, we're going to push to Maven snapshots, and each repository has its URL. It's not the same as you see here in the browser URL. You can see it either in the detail view. So if I click in, here you see the URL of that specific repository. So we can actually copy the whole thing. Again, this is IP address of Nexus, the port of Nexus, and the path to the repository. Or you can also copy it from here, like this. So we can copy the whole thing actually. It's really the same. And as I said, we are uploading to snapshots. Here my version also ends with snapshot. If I would release it, then we'll remove the snapshot suffix and upload it to Maven releases. And here we have the credentials block, username and password. And these are the username and password of the Nexus user that we created. However, this file needs to be checked in to version control. So we don't want to write the username and password directly here. And because of that, we're going to create Gradle properties file. and we're going to read those two values from the properties file. So in the project, let's create that Gradle properties. Let's add. Here you see the icon, because the editor detected it is the properties file. And here we can define key value pairs. Let's call it repo user, repo password. So the properties are already defined here. And now we can reference those properties from here using project.property name, repo user, and here project.repo password. We're going to configure one more thing, which is the name of the application itself in settings.gradle. So let's call it my app instead of Java app. So this settings Gradle basically will be used to generate the name of the jar file. So this will be the project name and this will be the version. And that's why we'll know here, the name will be my-app and this is going to be the version. So this is how the jar file name location will end up looking like. And another thing to do here, because we're not accessing our Nexus repository using HTTPS, we need to add this line here, which will allow us to access the repositories using HTTP. So with this, we have everything configured. Let's actually refresh the project so that Gradle can download all the things it needs to download. And this will configure Gradle with all the necessary information to upload a jar file that we're going to generate using build command to a Nexus repository at this URL using these credentials. So now we are going to build our application using Gradle command. And if I click in the project, build folder got created, same that we defined here. And inside we have libs, and this is our jar file. The name was taken from here, and the version was taken from here. So now that we have the jar file, we can actually upload it to Nexus. I'm going to go back to the editor and move into this Java app. So here I am in the root directory of that project. This is our build folder where we have the jar file. And now, in order to upload the jar file, we're going to execute Gradle publish command. So first of all, this command is not available in Gradle by default. This command was added using that plugin that we installed. This plugin here made the command available in Gradle, and we have configured Gradle with all the information necessary so that publish command knows what to publish and where to publish that artifact to. So we're going to execute this command. And you see publish Maven task gets executed. And we see the progress of jar file actually being uploaded to the Nexus repository. It says successful. So let's go back to Nexus. And since this is the administrator view, we're not going to see artifacts here. So we need to switch to browse components. And this is the user view where you can actually see the components in different repositories. Let's go into Maven snapshots. And here you see our application. This is the package name, com.example. This is taken from the group value. This is the name of the application, obviously, and this is the version. And these are some metadata to this component. And if I expand it, and this one as well, here you see the actual jar file. And in addition to the jar file, you see a bunch of other files and metadata files and so on, which is the way Nexus actually stores components. So you are uploading one specific artifact, which is jar, but some metadata and additional data and files get generated as information or additional information for that jar file. So there you go, we published our first jar artifact to Nexus Repository using Gradle build tool. So now let's move on to a Java Maven project, and let's do the same using Maven tool. So we're going to upload a jar file to Nexus Repository. This is our pom.xml file, and this is where we're going to configure the upload configuration. So the same way as we did in Gradle project, with Maven, we're also going to need to configure the artifact and the address of the repository. So we're going to set the URL of Nexus Repository of Maven snapshots. And the second part is going to be to configure credentials so that Maven can actually upload the jar to Nexus using a Nexus user that we created. So first, let's configure a plugin in Maven, same way as we did in Gradle, that will enable Maven to upload jar file. So right here, I'm going to paste in the code for that. So here, this is a block that configures the deploy plugin. So this will enable Maven to actually deploy jar to Nexus. And this first block here is just defining that we need that plugin and what version of the plugin we need. And this block is basically actually making use of that defined plugin. So it's like defining a variable and then using a variable comparison. So once we do that, we can refresh the project so that Maven can actually download my plugin. Let's do that. And as a next step, we're going to configure the location of Nexus Repository. So here I'm going to paste in something called distribution management. So this part here basically lets me configure repository for my snapshots. Here you see the tag name snapshot repository. And here I have the URL of Nexus Maven snapshots repository. This is the same URL that is defined here. This one right here. And this is the ID that we assign it. So we can call it whatever. Let's actually leave it at Nexus snapshots. And this is to identify the repository if you have multiple of them configured in your Maven configuration, so that you can reference which repository from the list of repositories, if you had a list, you actually mean. And for releases repository, obviously you'll have its own tag. So this will be enough for Maven to find the repository and connect to it. And now we need to configure credentials so Maven can also authenticate with it using the Nexus user. And the way we configure user credentials for repository in Maven is in .m2 folder in your user directory. So let's go back to the terminal and display the .m2 folder. It is right here. This is a hidden folder in your home directory. And inside here we have repository folder, which holds all the locally downloaded dependencies of your Maven projects. And in this folder, in .m2 folder, the same level, we are going to create, let's actually move inside, right? And inside this .m2 directory, we're going to create a file called settings.xml. And this is a file where Maven's global credentials can be defined. So this is going to be accessible for all your Maven projects. So let's create that file. Let's call it settings.xml. This should be exactly the name. And right here, I'm going to paste in the contents. So this is what we need to configure the credentials. So you have settings, list of settings here, and servers is basically credentials to any server that Maven has to authenticate to. Here you see we have the ID defined, which is the same ID or the same name as we have defined right here. So That's what I meant. If you have multiple repositories, you need ID to reference them. So in this case, we're referencing that using the ID. And here we have the username, which is Nexus user, and Nexus user password. So let's set it. And file is saved. We have configured the credentials here. And now everything is set up to upload the jar file to that Nexus repository. So let's clear that up. So the first thing is we need to build a jar, the artifact, and then we're gonna execute a command to push the jar to Nexus. So on the command line, I'm gonna move into my Java Maven app project. So I have moved in my Java Maven project. These are the contents of the project. And from here, I can execute the Maven command to build the artifact, Maven package. Let's execute it. Successful. And here you see target. And this is our jar file right here. Java Maven app and the version. All this is defined right here. We have the group ID, we have the artifact ID, and we have the version. So using these values, the jar file is going to be created, as you see here. So now let's clear this up again. And now using Maven deploy command, we can upload the jar to Nexus repository. Everything is configured again. We don't have to pass anything on as parameters. Just execute the command. And you see some output here where different tasks are getting executed. This is the plugin, the Maven deploy plugin that we've defined here. So this actually enables Maven to execute that job or the task. So if we go back to our Nexus UI, to browse, components, let's go to snapshots, and here we have the second jar file uploaded from Maven project. And here you see the structure of the components. So because I have two jar files that have the same group ID, which is com.example, the dot basically is transformed into this tree format, and I have those two artifacts in that tree-like structure. So using the group ID, you can group the artifacts inside the repository. So this is the one from Maven, and this is the one from Gradle project. And if we expand that, and this one as well, here you see the jar.